Shalom. So towards the beginning of the parasha, God says to Moses, I've now heard the groaning of the people of Israel, and that's why he's going to rescue them. Okay, and according to the Sfas Emes, it is precisely this crying out that caused the generation of the Exodus to merit redemption, right? I mean, according to the Torah, they were slaves for 400 years, right? And it's interesting that that is roughly the length of time that slavery existed in this country as well, or this continent. Why did they not get rescued earlier? Well, according to the Sfas Emes, because they asked, right? And there's this pattern in the Psalms as well, that the distressed cry out to God, God hears, and then God comes to their aid, right? And the question is, why is this pattern necessary, right? I'm suffering, I ask God for help, God comes to my aid, right? I mean, what? God doesn't know that I need help until I cry out? If God is omniscient, God already knows. Why is it necessary for me to cry out? Because a person who doesn't even cry out for help may be beyond help, right? They're so, right? I mean, we know, we've all seen people, right, who are so beaten down by life that there's nothing that can be done for them, right? And Israel merited redemption only when they came to realize that redemption is possible. Right now, since October 7th, and even before, there's been a lot of ferment and controversy on college campuses, right, about biased or allegedly biased teaching about Israel and the Middle East. But I have to tell you, this is not something new, right? I started my career at UVA Hillel in 1988. And the first year that I was there, it might have been second semester, so it might have been the beginning of 1989, a student came to me, a very active Hillel student, and he complained that the textbook that they were using in their Middle East Studies class was biased, right? Because it said that Zionism was originally seen as opposed to the Jewish religion. Okay, so what I needed to do, according to this student, was go to the professor and explain to him that that book was biased and he needed to find a less biased book, right? But I didn't do that. Why? Because it was true, right? Zionism was originally seen as a revolution, if you will, against Judaism, right? Because in traditional Judaism, exile was seen as a punishment, right? God sent us into exile, and God will determine when the exile ends, right? And trying to end the exile prematurely, if you will, was chutzpah klapei shamayim, right? Chutzpah against God, right? And on top of that, the early Zionists were, for the most part, at best, non-religious, if not anti-religious, right? And I mean, right? All of us, our Bubbies and Zadies, were very, very Orthodox, right? Unless you're a convert, right? But it's not true, okay? I mean, there were in New York City on the Lower East Side in the early 1900s, socialist and communist Jewish organizations organized Yom Kippur balls. Okay, and in Israel or in Palestine at the same time, on Yom Kippur, people marched to the Western Wall eating ham sandwiches. Okay, so it's really no surprise that the Haredim in particular saw this as anti-religious. And they saw it as anti-religious because it was anti-religious. But Rav Kook, Abraham Isaac Kook, developed a synthesis, right? And that's why, I mean, today in Israel, or even in Orthodox, right, there are Haredi Jews who are still non or anti-Zionist, right? But modern Orthodox Jews, right, and how we tell the difference, right? The kippah, right? If they wear a black velvet kippah, they're Haredi. If they wear a leather or a knit kippah, they're not Haredi, right? But Rav Kook's synthesis was that, right, once the temple was built, right, only Jews could go in, right? And the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodeshim, I mean, we read this on Yom Kippur, only the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, could go in there, and only on Yom Kippur. Right, but while it was being built, anybody could go in there, right? You had workmen coming in, and they weren't even necessarily Jewish, right? If we read the story of the building of the temple under King Solomon, right? His ally, King Hiram of Tsur, Hiram of Tyre, right? Southern Lebanon, still in the news, right? But he sent workmen to work on the temple, right? They weren't Jewish, right? But the temple wasn't dedicated. And it occurred to me, by the way, I mean, literally on my way to the hospital a couple of weeks ago for my surgery, right? You pass the Mormon temple, right? Nobody can go in there except Mormons, right? But within the last few years, they did a complete renovation of the temple. And in order to do that, they had to deconsecrate it, right? Because the workmen are not necessarily Mormon, right? So between the time that the renovation was actually completed and it was rededicated, you could sign up and you could go in and see the temple, right? I don't know if anybody here did that, right? But you could have done it, right? But once the temple was reconsecrated, only Mormons could go in there. But it's the exact same thing, okay? So Rav Kook said that this is the analogy, right? That these anti-religious Chazer fressers, right? And they were literally Chazer fressers, right? Were building the third temple and doing God's work, even if they didn't know it or acknowledge it, right? So, the question now, why do I speak about this morning? Okay, because the question, I see this on social media all the time, right? So I mentioned 4 more hostages were released this morning, but you should also know that the continuation of this deal is now up in the air, right? Because civilian hostages were supposed to be released first and only then soldiers. And this morning, they released 4 female soldiers, right? And why does this matter? It matters because, and this is what I'm going to get into, Israel agreed that for every civilian hostage that was released, they would release 30 Palestinian security prisoners, right? But for every soldier, 50 to 1. 30 to 1 for civilians, 50 to 1 for soldiers. So Hamas was like front loading this morning the soldiers to get more prisoners out. And Israel said, we're going to honor them. We're going to release 200 security prisoners. But then we're going to sit down and have a discussion with Hamas about this because they violated the deal, right? But the question is, and I see this asked on social media all the time, why in the world would Israel agree to a deal like this, right? 30 prisoners or 50 prisoners for each hostage. And this past week, I have to tell you, for many of my colleagues in the conservative rabbinate, they're a generation younger than, not even half a generation younger than me, but people that I know, people that I've been at conferences, fellowships with, whatever. This was very difficult this week because in 2002, you remember there was a whole wave of terrorism, and a number 19 bus was blown up in Jerusalem on Jaffa Road, and a JTS rabbinic student and his girlfriend were among the people who were murdered on that bus. And their murderer was released last week. Okay, so very, very emotionally difficult, right? So why would Israel agree to something like this? And I remember back towards the beginning of the war, a friend of mine, a colleague, an American rabbi, but he's lived now in Israel for more than 30 years. And his son is a combat officer in the IDF and has been called up for reserve several times during this war. But he wrote that his son said at a Shabbat lunch shortly after October 7th, that if Israel doesn't bring all of the hostages back, it has lost its reason to exist. Okay, which is a pretty shocking statement, right? But my friend said, I should tell you, I don't want to mention his name because he didn't necessarily say this, to be given over in a sermon and put on the internet, right? But he's well known in the American Jewish community as somebody who writes about Israel and speaks all in this country all over and speaks to American groups visiting in Israel, right? And that, a very prominent pro-Israel voice. But he said that he thought about it and he realized that he agrees with his son, right? If Israel doesn't bring the hostages back, Israel has lost its reason to, I'm not saying it's right to exist, okay? Its reason to exist, right? Because there is an unwritten but explicit covenant between Israel and its citizens, right? Especially if you're in the army or if you live on the frontier, right? And, most of the civilians who were taken hostage, where were they taken from? Kibbutzim that are right on the Gaza border, right? And it's important. And as somebody, look, I lived on the Jordanian border for 2 years, okay? Much quieter than the Gaza border, but still, right? There's an understanding, right? That we will bring you back and we will do whatever is necessary to bring you back. And this is a covenant. And we don't abandon our people. And if this covenant is not kept, then Israel has failed, right? And that's why, I think I discussed this, I did discuss this in one of my classes, but, they're not as well attended as Shabbat services, right? But, in America, you wear a hostage, one of the yellow ribbons or a shirt that says, bring them home. It's seen as because you're pro-Israel, right? In Israel, this is directed against the government. Right? This is absolutely, and all of the protests and what are directed against the government. Why? Because the government failed, right? The government failed on October 7th. This is not to excuse Hamas, right? But Israel propped up Hamas as an alternative to the PLO, right? And they said, we keep giving money to Hamas, they'll be quiet, right? And there were warnings that this was happening, and the warnings were ignored, right? And the most basic obligation of any government to protect its own people, right? And they failed to do so, and they failed to take responsibility, right? It's not a presidential system where it's a 4-year term, right? It's a parliamentary system where it's understood that when there's a major Hebrew word is mechdal, all right?
Mess up,
Screw up, okay? When there's a major screw up, the government resigns, right? And not only did the government not resign, where's the commission of inquiry? Right? Where's the commission of, which is just a basic norm in Israeli society, right? But there's no, so the bring them home demonstrations are directed against the government, right? And ultimately, so you know what? Is this deal unbalanced? Yes. Is it unfair? Yes. Is it a bad deal? Yes, it is a bad deal, right? In the same way that, I don't know who said this, but it's a well-known saying, right? Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all other forms of government. And this is a bad deal, but not taking it would have been worse, right? Because this is what we do, right? And I say we, right? We here don't make the decisions, right? But on the other hand, I got up at 4, right? Israeli broadcasting has an app, right? In fact, I even learned the Hebrew word for app. It's called Yisimon, okay? They have the Yisimon, and you can watch Israeli TV on your phone. And depending on your phone and your TV, you can stream it from your phone to your TV. I got up at 4 o'clock this morning to watch the exchange, right? And yes, it's Shabbos and I watch TV. Okay, and this is another, I mean, and I'll wrap up this, right? But why are these exchanges taking place on Shabbos? Okay, I mean, last one was on Sunday, but the cabinet met on Shabbos to agree, right? Because Hamas, I mean, most of the leaders of Hamas have spent years in Israeli jails. Right? Unlike most American Jews, the leaders of Hamas speak fluent Hebrew, right? And they understand Israeli society, and I am absolutely convinced that they set this up on Shabbat, Drasha, right? Because the question is, right, like, because I saw this being discussed on Israeli TV this morning, right? Does the prime minister get on TV on Shabbos and make a statement welcoming them home? And he did, okay? And the president, who is basically an observant conservative Jew, right? He was a staff member at Camp Ramah, okay? Is the president going to tweet on Shabbos, welcome home? And he did, right? And I am convinced that Hamas decided that these releases would be on Shabbos to create these dilemmas, right? I mean, there's no question, right? The army has to do what it has to do on Shabbat, and they have to meet them at the border, and they have to fly them to the hospital. There's no question about it, right? But making a welcome home tweet is not exactly off message, right? But this is what we do because we're family, right? We're family and we take care of each other. And if the state of Israel doesn't take care of its citizens, it's failed. It's failed, and all of the suffering that Jews went through and all of the suffering that Palestinians went through, all in vain, because the raison d'etre no longer exists. And this is why, as horrible and as painful and unbalanced and unfair as this deal is, anger. Right? There's no choice, and this is why I believe that Israel will hem and haw about the fact that Hamas violated the deal, which they did, and it's going to continue anyway because there's absolutely no choice, as painful as it is. Shabbat Shalom.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah. Hold, let me get closer to you so I can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to go back to what you said about God is omniscient. He knew the people were in trouble. Why did it take so long? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.